Sheriff Maria Valdez received the Border Patrol request at 4:23 a.m. on a scorching August morning when the desert temperature was already approaching 90 degrees. Agent Linda Harper reported finding footprints in the sand near Columbus, hundreds of them, all heading north from the border, but ending abruptly 3 miles into U.S. territory with no explanation. "Sheriff, I've been working this border for 15 years. Harper's voice carried genuine confusion. "I've tracked smuggling routes, chased coyotes, found bodies. But I've never seen anything like this. 217 distinct footprints, men, women, and children, all walking in single file. Then they just stop." Valdez assembled her team, Deputy Carlos Ramirez and Detective Frank Torres, and met Harper at the coordinates. The sun was rising over the Chihuahuan Desert, painting the sand in shades of orange and red, making the footprint trail starkly visible. The prints were fresh, no more than 6 hours old based on the sand displacement patterns. They showed a group moving purposefully north, maintaining tight formation, not the scattered, desperate tracks of people fleeing or lost. These travelers knew exactly where they were going. 217 people, Torres counted as they followed the trail. "That's a massive crossing. Why didn't any of our sensors pick them up?" Harper checked her equipment. They didn't. No thermal signatures, no seismic alerts, no camera triggers. It's like they were ghosts walking through our detection grid. The trail led through terrain that should have been impassable for a large group. Rocky outcrops, dense mesquite thickets, areas with no water source. Yet the footprints showed steady progress, no signs of hesitation or route changes. At exactly 3 miles from the border, the footprints ended. Not scattered, not confused into multiple directions, just ended. The last print was complete and clear in the sand. Beyond it, nothing. No disturbance of the desert surface, no indication of vehicles, no explanation for how 217 people could simply cease leaving tracks. "They didn't fly away," Ramirez said, scanning the sky as if expecting to see evidence of helicopters. "And they didn't dissolve. So where did they go?" Valdez knelt at the final footprint. Adult male, size 9 or 10 shoe, worn sole pattern suggesting cheap sneakers commonly used by border crossers. The print was pressed firmly into the sand, indicating normal weight distribution. The person had been walking normally when they made this track. "Fan out. Search pattern. Look for any disturbance within a 100-yard radius." The team spent 3 hours searching. No additional tracks, no buried evidence, no signs of any activity beyond the main trail. It was as if 217 people had walked to this exact spot and vanished into thin air. "Sheriff, we need to see this," Torres called from 50 yards east. He'd found something that made Valdez's blood run cold. In the center of a cleared patch of sand, someone had arranged rocks into a symbol, a spiral pattern with radiating lines, clearly deliberate, recently created. "That's not random," Harper said. "That's a marker." A waypoint. Torres photographed it from multiple angles. "I've seen similar symbols in archaeological sites, pre-Columbian, possibly Anasazi, or earlier. But this is fresh, made within the last few hours." As they documented the symbol, Valdez noticed something else. The air around the marker felt different, thicker somehow, harder to breathe. And there was a sound, barely audible, like distant voices speaking in rhythm. "Does anyone else hear that?" she asked. All 4 of them did. Chanting or singing, coming from no specific direction. The sound seemed to emanate from the ground itself, as if the desert was broadcasting something buried deep beneath the sand. Ramirez's radio suddenly crackled with transmissions in Spanish, but distorted, layered over itself, dozens of voices speaking at once. Through the static, Valdez caught fragments. Crossing over, the old ways, no longer bound by. Then silence, complete, absolute silence. Even the normal desert sounds, wind, insects, birds, had stopped. We're leaving, Valdez decided. Now. As they retreated toward their vehicles, Torres looked back. The footprint trail was fading, disappearing before their eyes as if time was reversing, erasing evidence of the impossible crossing. By the time they reached the border, the trail was completely gone. Only the rock symbol remained, and their photographs proving 217 people had walked into the desert and vanished. Over the following weeks, Valdez investigated similar reports. Border Patrol agents finding footprint trails that ended inexplicably. Groups of people spotted on remote roads who disappeared when approached. Voices heard in the desert speaking languages that predated Spanish colonization. They're not smuggling routes, Torres concluded after reviewing historical data. These trails follow ancient migration paths, routes used by indigenous peoples thousands of years ago. So what? Ancient ghosts are crossing the border? Or something else? What if the border, the modern political boundary, intersects with older boundaries? Spiritual or dimensional borders that have existed far longer than the line drawn between nations. With increasing alarm, Dr. Martinez reviewed the evidence. The footprints showed normal pressure patterns. These weren't hallucinations. They were real, physical creatures. However, their disappearance implies that they entered a state that is impossible to identify or quantify. Agent Harper brought information from the Border Patrol that was classified. Over the previous 5 years, we have 37 cases on file. At certain waypoints, large groups would cross, leave obvious evidence, and then disappear. Those rock symbols are present at every waypoint. Additionally, they are all situated on historic trade routes or hallowed locations. Are they dangerous? Valdez inquired. I don't know. At these locations, we have never found a body. No signs of violence were discovered. They simply move on to another location, using the border as a gateway to places that aren't marked on maps. Regular patrols of the waypoint locations were approved by Valdez, but he gave strict instructions not to obstruct them. Law enforcement had no procedures in place for when people, living or not, used historic routes that crossed the present border. Footprint trails kept showing up, months apart, sometimes weekly, always in single file, always in big groups, and always coming to a stop at waypoints with symbols that existed before colonial America. Agents of the Border Patrol also occasionally claimed to have seen the travelers themselves. Quiet procession through the desert that was briefly visible before disappearing from view. People who existed in a state between the physical and something else, utilizing pathways that connected realities in ways that modern borders couldn't control, were not exactly ghosts. Valdez kept detailed records, knowing they'd never make official reports. How could she document that the border wasn't just a political line, but a threshold where ancient migration routes still operated, where people could walk from one reality to another, leaving footprints in the sand as their only evidence of passage? The desert kept its secrets, as it always had, and the footprint trails that led nowhere continued to appear, testament to journeys that transcended both international boundaries and the limitations of human understanding. Deputy Carlos Ramirez was conducting a routine patrol near Hatch when his radio suddenly locked onto a signal it shouldn't have been able to receive. Instead of dispatch, he heard smooth jazz music and a male voice speaking perfect English with a 1950s broadcaster accent. This is KROD, your voice of the border, bringing you the finest entertainment from Las Cruces, New Mexico. The time is 7:35 p.m., temperature is a comfortable 78 degrees, and remember folks, keep your doors locked. Strange things have been reported near the border tonight. Ramirez checked his radio settings. He was on the department's encrypted frequency, not any public AM or FM band. Yet the broadcast continued with crystal clarity, as if he was tuned directly to this impossible station. "Sheriff, are you hearing this?" he transmitted. Static. No response from Valdez or dispatch. Just the smooth voice continuing. "We have reports coming in from listeners near Columbus about unusual lights in the desert. If you're out there tonight, folks, stay vigilant. The border isn't always what it seems." Then music. Moonlight Serenade by Glenn Miller. Perfectly clear, as if broadcast yesterday rather than from an era when Ramirez's grandparents were children. He pulled over and researched on his phone. KROD had been a real radio station in Las Cruces, operating from 1948 to 1952. It went off the air permanently on September 15, 1952, after all 7 staff members vanished during a night broadcast. Their bodies were never found, and the station was never reopened. The date on Ramirez's dashboard: September 15th. 71 years to the day after KROD's final broadcast. The music faded, and the announcer returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're receiving disturbing reports from our listeners near the border. People are seeing things they can't explain. Lights in the desert, voices speaking in unknown languages, figures that don't cast shadows. If you're experiencing anything unusual, please call the station at..." The phone number given was from the 1950s era, before area codes, before modern dialing systems. Ramirez tried searching for it anyway, and found archival records. That number had belonged to KROD's emergency line, used for weather warnings and civil defense alerts. "This is Carlos Ramirez, deputy with Doña Ana County Sheriff's Department," he transmitted on his radio. "If anyone can hear this, please respond." The announcer's voice came back immediately, as if responding to him. "We're hearing from a law enforcement officer now. Deputy Ramirez, if you're out there, listen carefully. What's about to happen at the border station isn't your fault. The broadcast must continue, even if we can't." Ramirez felt ice in his veins. The announcer had used his name, addressed him directly, despite speaking from a broadcast made 71 years ago. "The 7 of us here at KROD have made a decision," the voice continued, taking on an urgency that hadn't been there before. "We've been documenting strange occurrences along the border for years. Tonight, something is coming through, something that's been trying to cross over since before there was a border to cross. We're going to try to contain it, to keep broadcasting a signal that holds it back. But we don't think we'll survive." The music resumed, but distorted now, playing at wrong speeds, the melody warping into something that sounded almost like screaming. Ramirez drove toward the coordinates the announcer had mentioned, a location near the old KROD transmission tower, which still stood as a rusted monument to obsolete technology. When he arrived, he found Detective Torres already there, standing at the base of the tower with a strange expression on his face. "You heard it too?" Ramirez asked. "Not heard. Saw." Torres pointed at the tower. "Look at the lights." The tower shouldn't have been operational. It had been decommissioned in 1952, no power source, no equipment. Yet lights were flickering up its length in patterns that looked almost like Morse code. "It's broadcasting," Ramirez said. 71 years later, it's still broadcasting." Torres had brought historical records. September 15th, 1952. The 7 KROD staff members were doing a special overnight program about border mysteries. According to listener accounts, they started reporting something approaching from the Mexican side, something that wasn't human. Their final transmission mentioned trying to create a signal barrier to keep it from crossing. What happened to them? They vanished mid-broadcast. The station went to dead air at 11:47 p.m. When authorities arrived the next morning, the studio was empty, but showed signs of struggle, and the equipment had been deliberately modified, arranged in patterns that suggested they were trying to create some kind of electromagnetic cage. Ramirez's radio crackled again. The announcer's voice, more desperate now. To anyone receiving this transmission in the future, and we know you will, we've seen how time works at the border, you need to understand. We didn't disappear. We're still here, trapped in the broadcast signal, holding the barrier. Every September 15th, when the dimensional walls are thinnest, the transmission comes through clearly. We're asking for help we know we can't receive, warning about dangers that have already passed or haven't arrived yet. Time doesn't work the same way at the border, Torres realized. The station staff did something that trapped them in a temporal loop. They're broadcasting from 1952, but also from every September 15th since then, all simultaneously. The tower lights intensified, and both deputies heard it clearly now. Not just one announcer, but 7 voices overlapping, all speaking at once. Deputy Ramirez. Detective Torres. You're hearing this because you're sensitive to the frequencies, because you're standing at a convergence point where multiple timelines intersect. We've been broadcasting warnings for 71 years, but until now, nobody understood enough to help. How do we help you? Ramirez called out. You can't. But you can continue our work. Document the border anomalies. Record the strange occurrences. Keep the signal barrier active by acknowledging it, by bearing witness. The thing we stopped in 1952 is still trying to cross. It's patient, immortal, and it only needs the signal to fade for one September 15th for it to break through. What is it? Older than the border. Older than the nations on either side. It existed in this desert before humans built civilizations, and it's been trying to reclaim territory ever since we carved boundaries through its domain. We're not sure if it's conscious or just a force of nature, but it's hungry for the modern world, eager to unmake the structures humans have imposed on land that it considers its own. Sheriff Valdez arrived with a technical team. They set up equipment to record the broadcasts, to measure the electromagnetic patterns around the tower. Every reading showed impossible activity. Radio signals from frequencies that had been retired decades ago, power flowing through equipment that had no source, voices transmitting from a station that officially didn't exist. This is bigger than law enforcement, Valdez decided. We need federal resources, scientists who understand temporal physics. But when FBI agents arrived, the broadcasts stopped. The tower went dark. All the recordings showed only static. It only manifests for locals, Torres realized. For people who have a connection to this area, who understand the border not as a political line, but as something older and stranger. Federal outsiders can't perceive it. The September 15th broadcasts became an annual event, carefully monitored by Valdez's department. Each year, they'd hear the KROD announcers, trapped in their 1952 time loop, still maintaining the signal barrier that kept something ancient from crossing into the modern world. And each year, the announcers sounded a little more exhausted, a little less human, as if the decades of maintaining the barrier were wearing away at their trapped consciousness. How long can they hold? Ramirez asked during one annual vigil. Maybe forever, Valdez said. Or maybe 1 year the signal will fail, and we'll find out what they've been keeping back for 71 years. But they continued their duty, documenting each broadcast, bearing witness to the sacrifice of 7 radio station employees who'd become eternal guardians, trapped in electromagnetic amber, holding a barrier between the modern world and something that existed before borders, before nations, before human civilization tried to impose order on desert chaos. The KROD broadcasts continue every September 15th, a ghostly reminder that the border between Mexico and the United States isn't the only boundary being maintained in the New Mexico desert, and that some sacrifices echo across decades, creating loops in time that serve purposes no official records will ever acknowledge. Detective Frank Torres took the call at 2:17 a.m. from a rancher named Tom Gutierrez, who claimed his livestock were talking in Spanish and warning about something coming from the south. Standard protocol would have dismissed this as a prank, but Gutierrez was a respected member of the community, a third-generation rancher with no history of mental health issues or substance abuse. "Detective, I know how this sounds," Gutierrez's voice carried genuine fear. "But my cattle have been speaking perfect Spanish for 3 hours. They're not just making sounds, they're forming words, sentences, warnings, and they're all saying the same thing. No cruchen, algo viene, don't cross, something is coming." Torres drove to the Gutierrez ranch with Deputy Ramirez, arriving to find the owner standing in his barn, surrounded by cattle that were indeed making unusual vocalizations. Not normal lowing or distressed sounds, but something that created rhythmic patterns eerily similar to human speech. "Listen," Gutierrez urged, pointing at a Holstein cow. "She's been the most vocal." Torres listened skeptically, expecting pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive patterns in random sounds, but what he heard defied easy explanation. The cow's vocalizations formed distinct syllables. No, cruchen, la, frontera, algo, terrible, viene. Don't cross the border. "Something terrible is coming," Torres translated unnecessarily. Ramirez recorded the sounds on his phone, playing them back. The pattern was consistent, repeating every few minutes. Other cattle joined in, creating a chorus of warnings that sounded like human voices processed through animal vocal anatomy. Not quite right, but unmistakably language. Dr. Martinez arrived with veterinary specialists. They examined the animals, finding no physical abnormalities, no diseases, no explanations for the behavior. "Their vocal anatomy can't produce these sounds," a veterinarian said. "Cattle lack the necessary structures for human phonemes, yet we're all hearing what sounds like Spanish. It's as if something is using the animals as loudspeakers." Broadcasting through them, Torres realized. The KROD signal, the footprint trails that disappear. The border is a transmission medium. Something uses it to send messages, warnings, projections. Over the following hours, the phenomenon spread. Other nearby ranches reported similar occurrences. Horses neighing in patterns that sounded like counting. Dogs barking in rhythms that resembled speech. Even chickens creating vocal patterns that, when slowed down and analyzed, contained fragments of words. All delivering the same warning. Don't cross. Something is coming. "Coming from where?" Valdez demanded when she arrived to coordinate the response. "From Mexico? From something else?" The answer came at dawn. All the animals suddenly went silent, not just the ones speaking, but every animal within a 5-mile radius of the border. Complete, unnatural silence. No birds, no insects, no cattle sounds, just oppressive quiet that pressed against their eardrums. Then, on the southern horizon, something appeared. It looked like a dust storm at first, but moved wrong. Too fast, too purposefully, not following wind patterns. And within the dust were shapes, too large to be human, moving with gaits that didn't match any known animal. "What is that?" Ramirez whispered. Torres had seen enough. Everyone back to vehicles. We're evacuating this area, but the ranchers refused to leave their property. This is our land. We're not abandoning it to whatever that is. The approaching storm stopped exactly at the border, as if hitting an invisible wall. The shapes within became more visible. Tall figures that might have been humanoid, but with proportions that hurt to look at directly. Limbs that bent at wrong angles. Heads that suggested skulls, but with features that didn't align with any known biology. The animals were warning us about them, Gutierrez said. Whatever these things are, they can't cross. Something keeps them on the Mexican side. The KROD signal, Torres remembered. The electromagnetic barrier the station staff created. It's not just holding back one thing, it's maintaining a boundary that prevents those from crossing. The figures remained at the border for 3 hours, occasionally testing the invisible barrier with what might have been hands, or might have been appendages humans had no vocabulary to describe. Each time they touched the boundary, the air shimmered, and for brief moments the observers could hear that radio signal from 1952, the KROD announcers maintaining their eternal broadcast, holding the line. Eventually, the figures retreated back into Mexican territory, dissolving into the desert as mysteriously as they'd appeared. The animals resumed normal behavior immediately, no longer speaking or warning, as if the emergency had passed. This happens regularly, Valdez asked Gutierrez. Few times a year. Sometimes the animals warn us, sometimes they don't. Depends on how strong the breach attempt is. Most times we just see unusual weather or hear strange sounds. This was the worst I've seen in 20 years of ranching here. Torres filed reports that would never be officially acknowledged. How could law enforcement document that the border between nations was also a barrier between realities, that livestock could be used as transmission devices for warnings, that things that shouldn't exist tried periodically to cross into the modern world, but were held back by the trapped consciousness of radio station employees from 1952? The ranchers resumed their work, but with new understanding. They were more than cattle farmers and agricultural workers. They were unwitting sentinels, living on land where the border meant more than politics, where their animals could become prophets when dimensional walls grew thin, where vigilance meant watching not just for human border crossers, but for things that predated humanity's claim to these lands. Sheriff Maria Valdez compiled her final report on the 3 unexplained phenomena, knowing it would be filed away in classified databases that few would ever access. The footprint trails that vanished, the radio station trapped in temporal loop, the ranch animals that spoke warnings, 3 impossible occurrences that shared common truth. The border wasn't just a line on a map. The indigenous peoples knew, Torres told her during their final briefing. Before Spanish colonization, before Mexican territory, before American annexation, they knew this land was a threshold, a place where realities overlapped, where ancient things still moved along paths that ignored human boundaries. And now we're the guardians, Ramirez added, whether we wanted the role or not. Valdez looked at maps covered in marked locations, waypoints where footprints vanished, coordinates where old broadcasts could be heard, ranches where animals became prophets. All clustered along the border, all suggesting that the line between nations intersected with something older and stranger. We document, we watch, we bear witness, she decided. We can't explain these phenomena to authorities who haven't experienced them. We can't protect people from dangers that officially don't exist, but we can maintain records, respond when possible, and try to understand patterns. The work continued, as it always would. Border Patrol agents finding evidence of impossible crossings, Law enforcement investigating reports that defied conventional explanation, ranchers learning to interpret warnings broadcast through their livestock, and always the knowledge that the border was more than politics, more than immigration control, more than the sum of its official functions. It was a threshold where time looped back on itself, where ancient things still attempted crossing, where sacrifices made decades ago continued protecting the present from threats nobody fully understood. New Mexico's border kept its secrets, and those assigned to patrol it learned to live with mysteries that would never be solved, only managed. The desert stretched endlessly in both directions, holding beneath its surface truths that predated nations and boundaries, that would persist long after modern borders were redrawn or dissolved. And somewhere in the electromagnetic spectrum, the KROD announcers maintained their eternal broadcast, still holding the barrier after 71 years, still warning about dangers that approached each September 15th, still trapped in their sacrifice, but somehow still protecting those who lived in the shadow of their station's transmission tower. The footprints would continue appearing and vanishing. The animals would continue speaking when warnings were needed. And the border would continue being more than a line on a map. It would remain a threshold, a boundary, a place where the impossible happened regularly enough to be documented, but rarely enough to be denied.